Greetings, friends. My name is Pablo Suarez. I am one of many in a team that is bringing to you this session about racism, exclusion, and risk. This session is brought to you through a joint effort of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, co-convener of this event, along with the World Bank's Social, Sustainability, and Inclusion team. We worked together on an event about racism and rather anti-racism a few weeks ago. And what you will experience today draws intensely from a two-day event that we held a few weeks ago. It is now time to dive into this. And it is not easy to have this conversation. This is a time when understanding risk as an event celebrates 10 years, and 10 years is reason for celebration, but as practitioners and as scholars of issues involving risk, there's a lot we need to learn. There's artificial intelligence, there's urban matters, there's decision-making, early warning systems, and you may wonder, what does any of this have to do with race and racism? Well, let me give you a very simple example. We're spending all this time using Zoom and digital technologies. In this particular case, there's a background behind me that is not the real background. I'm at home and there's stuff behind me at home. And there's a computer algorithm based on artificial intelligence that has learned to try to differentiate the shape of Pablo from the shape of non-Pablo. And it's learning, and it still has a lot to learn, as evidenced by the fact that when I move, well, yeah, let's recognize that there are weaknesses to this. Indeed, if you look behind me, you can see there's the poster of the documentary Mendler, right? I can play with its errors. Guess what? Algorithms, when they do facial recognition, they often are trained with white people, and they make mistakes more frequently with people of color, who have been sent to jail erroneously, who have been denied access to financial instruments and more because of how a racist society has encoded racial thought and racist practices into its algorithms. And if this is true of artificial intelligence, much more you can acknowledge the presence of racism in cities. Our urban environments have clearly distinguishable location of who is where. And very often, top of the hill, big wealthy house, you see one skin color, and you see another skin color in the floodplains, in the steep slopes that are unstable, in the hazard-prone areas. Decision-making, of course, there tends to be the reflection of racist thought in who holds power or doesn't. And the same is true of early warning systems, who gets the information, who gets access to nature, who has benefits of insurance. It's hard. And in this session, we could be sharing with you all sorts of graphs and mathematical models and data about the relationship of racism and risk, which is well explored. But I think it's also useful to use alternative modes of communication, such as cartoons. In this one, we see that, yes, the pandemic is happening and is posing more threats. We know the extent to which there are differences in deaths and suffering as a result of how different ethnicities are treated in their societies. The climate is changing. That also has a very strong signal on how differential impacts occur across society. We see conflict, whether it's armed conflict within a nation or street conflict, where we have seen and continue to see, unfortunately, racist violence exerted in the streets of developed countries. A dwindling economy, these disasters are collaborating better than we are. We need to figure out how are we going to make stuff happen. Now, in this session, I'm going to guide you through the first portion. My collaborator, Janot Mendler de Suarez, will be joining us shortly. Here she is. And let me move on with another cartoon that I find very useful for this kind of conversation. Let me do the following. Now the cartoon occupies the full screen. I will become a little bit smaller, maybe semi-transparent. This cartoon, to me, really speaks of where we are. I have, for 2.5 decades by now, been a researcher on climate disasters and financial instruments. And I have become a humanitarian worker about 15 years ago. And now I'm working with communicators, with creative types, to better convey what's going on. This cartoon really shows how I feel we are. Things are changing. And we know that change tends to be gradual until it is abrupt. And when we are approaching the dangerous cliff of suffering, we need to figure out what to do. The caption of this cartoon in its original form by Bob Mankoff, "We've got to talk." And this is what we're doing here at Understanding Risk. We're talking about what matters. And it turns out that risk and race do matter and do connect. But as far as we know, this is the first session that explicitly tries to explore that relationship. And when we do the talking, it's not easy. When you invite people to have a conversation about race and risk, very often those who do the talking, as is the case about gender, indigenous communities, and so on, it feels often that it's just talking, but nothing changes. It's like honking in a traffic jam. Now, sometimes the system doesn't make progress. You feel like there's no movement because the system itself is stuck. If there's a bridge in front of you that is being constructed and that construction creates out of 3 lanes 1, then you're not going to move forward no matter how much you honk. But maybe the paralysis, your inability to move forward, is not because of something made of cement. For some people, they are stopped by the forces of authority. This cartoon by Fego was created in the context of the workshop I mentioned earlier by the World Bank's SSI team. And I love how it depicts the fact that some individuals are treated as suspects from before they can even commit anything worthy of suspicion. And this has consequences, and those consequences shape the social construction of risk. We're going to do a first ever sharing of some analysis we just completed. We engaged our colleague Ruben Ng from the National University of Singapore, who looked with his team at all news media from North America, examining the occurrence of terms associated with race, in particular white, Caucasian, etc., or Black, African American, etc., and looking at all the newspapers over about a year between 2019 and 2020, and they examined the occurrence of words that distinguish people of certain alleged races, African American or Black, white or Caucasian, and found words that are within 6 just before or just after words. So in this example, the word suspect occurs before African American or after white. And what we did was to partner with our colleague Joe Spagnuolo to create a data visualization that, instead of being a normal and boring Excel graph, looks like this: an immersive experience, an installation. How suspect is race? A data sculpture looking at media mentions in black and white for North America, Canadian, and United States newspapers and published media, magazines, etc. If you walk in, this is what you see. On the right, you see the white mentions. How many times was the word suspect mentioned within 6 words of white, Caucasian, etc. And it's a timeline. In the beginning is October 2019, all the way to several months later. On the left, you see how often the word black is mentioned. And you see that blacks are co-occurring with suspect way more frequently. Let me give you a taste of this through an animation. This is what it looks like, but as you progress, you see the timeline, you see patterns. On the right, you can see the words that have occurred, a word cloud with the words that are associated with each term. And of course, as time progresses, you get over there, you get to see an anomaly. You know, until recently, it was mostly that the left side, black, was more suspect than white. But do you see that tall column? This, my friends, is from, let me come over here, the time of the killing of George Floyd. On the right, suddenly white becomes frequently occurring with the term suspect, whereas on the left, it is not. And even more surprisingly, I mean, it's almost zero. And notice on the right column, you see words like officer, you see terms that reveal quite clearly that this is something that was episodic when one white police officer essentially took the life of a black person. But unfortunately, the month after, everything got back to normal and the media portrayed black as suspects more than before. This, of course, is harmful, but it is the reality we have. Now, some of you may have been present at sessions in the context of UR where we spoke about racism through the powerful lens of humor. And you must be thinking, what? Humor and race and racism, what do the two have to do with each other? If I asked you, think about the word humor, what words come to mind? Feel free to write them in the chat if you want, but what do you think of when you think of humor? Most people think of words like laughter or fun, the manifestations of humor, or the mechanics, the devices that create the experience of humor, such as jokes, stand-up, comedy, etc. Of course, this is not what we're here for. We are not here to make fun of racism. Racism is a very serious matter, but humor can help us make sense of it. Humor can help us notice it. Humor can amplify the absurdities of what we experience. For example, this other cartoon by Bob Mankoff. Is this a cartoon about fish, or is it a cartoon about racism? Well, if you're a big fish, the word is just. If you're a small fish, there seems to be no justice in the world. But how do fish grow big or not? In this cartoon, those 3 fish could all belong to the same species. But if some fish had access to food, opportunity to grow, and others didn't, others were excluded from the resources that allow thriving, then maybe some become more powerful. We see this everywhere, and we have to confront it, again, because risk is socially constructed, and social asymmetries and power imbalances need to be confronted. One of the best successful cases of confronting powerful racist structures, Mahatma Gandhi. Look at this photo, look at how powerful this is. He, a very serene, peaceful, determined presence, surrounded by very energized people who were confronting, at the time, the most powerful empire, which was built, as a lot of society, on practices and assumptions that assigned more value to some people than to others based on the color of their skin. Now, there was a time when Gandhi and his followers were beginning to change the face of their nation in South Asia. And so eventually there was going to be a meeting between Gandhi and the king. And Gandhi was approaching the palace with his traditional humble robes. So a journalist asked, but Mr. Gandhi, do you think you're properly dressed to meet the king? I love his answer. Do not worry about my clothes. The king has enough for both of us. This is a powerful way to show how humor can dismantle understandings, assumptions, create questioning. And one of his most prominent students, especially in the practice of nonviolent protest, Martin Luther King, he also was a tactical and strategic user of humor. In a few moments, we're going to hear a very brief 1-minute long interview where the radio host asks about humor, and his short, charming answer may illuminate us. Daniel, if you can, please share with us.
The matter of humor and call and response, and your friend Ralph Abernathy, too. You've never lost this. Perhaps you can ask this now. I want to come to scriptures in a moment. This matter of humor through adversity. I know a close friend of yours is Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who I think is one of the funniest in a very wonderful way speakers I've heard for years.
Yes. Well, I think you've got to have the ability to engage in creative laughter in order to live amid difficulties and tension. If you can't laugh in life, you're a very miserable human being. And I think a great deal of truth often comes through laughter. And some people have developed the talent to get this truth over to many people by laughing the truth into them and out of them. So that I think humor is most important in getting at truth and getting people to understand, and often to rise above the despair which can surround them.
Despair can surround us in times of natural hazards and disasters. And if those confronting, powerful, violent forces could use humor to shed light, so can us, so can we. Sorry, it's 4 a.m. for me here in Boston. There's a lot of incongruity going on in my head, but check out this word cloud. Humorists, professional humorists, when thinking of humor, of course they think of laughter and jokes, but they mostly notice what is it about this world that is absurd. What are the sources of conflict, tension, contradiction? Where do we see incongruity, ambiguity? Where do we confront puzzlement, risk? Where does context matter? When do we have danger? Humor emerges more powerfully when there's a free zone of danger, and risk is danger, and racism is dangerous. So going back to you, if you're in this session, it must be because you have some questions about race and risk. Maybe you have experienced some things. Maybe you want to know some things thought by others. Very happy to share with you that we have engaged 3 professional humorists. Fego, originally from Mexico, Emily, based in New York, and Yasin Osman, who has worked intensely with regions in the Horn of Africa, supporting people in need. These 3 professional humorists, these 3 cartoon artists, are very well published in the New Yorker magazine, which is perhaps the most prominent place to celebrate the cartoon art form. And they have been part of 2 sessions of UR earlier, where we invited participants to view some cartoons, annotate them, and to co-create with our artists new humor. You are going to very soon be getting a taste of the more than 12 cartoons that they have created for you are in this event. A taste of them, 3 cartoons. The first one by Emily. Well, yes, we see the recognition of a need for people of color, but maybe not enough happening. I don't know how this cartoon makes you feel, whether some of you smiled or even laughed, maybe some of you frowned or even became as grouchy as this character. This is a rough draft that will undergo revisions. Maybe you can annotate it and suggest to Emily ways in which it could be even better. Next cartoon by Fego. I have to say, as an Argentinian male, I recognize myself in that talking head, unable to notice what goes on, what has gone on. In case you cannot read the font, the fellow bringing the book says risk and racism. Can we see, can we hear? Last cartoon I show before you go and enjoy them by Yasin. Yes, this is horrible. Hurricanes kill people, and the consequences are not appreciated equally by the rest of us. So you will go into a specially designed digital tool, we call it Gallery. You will see more than 12, about 15 of these recently created cartoons, and your task will be very simple. First, enjoy. Look at those cartoons from your experience, from the lens of this event, Race and Risk, and you'll be invited, if you want, to annotate them. Can you share any insights, any emotions, any questions, any feedback for the artist to improve the draft? Others from this event will see what you wrote, so think of it as an opportunity to leave a graffiti for your peers. What you will see when we give you the web address, the URL, something like this. You will enter UR6 as an event code. Once you go in, oh, by the way, I should mention, it works best with Chrome or Firefox. If possible, stay away from Safari or Explorer, some of those older ones. Once you go in, you will see a random cartoon among those 15 or so. If you want, you can type something for others to see, your emotion, your insight, your questions. Click submit. If you want, you can write an additional emotion comment or click on next. Daniel, would you like to share with our participants? ce.goodfocus.net. And once you get in there, the event code is UR6. Please go in and you'll have 5 to 10 minutes to enjoy and annotate. The rest of this session will begin by sharing with you some of the cartoons created in previous sessions. For example, this cartoon was created by Jeremy Nguyen, one of the artists that joined the previous session. And yes, round but not equal. By the way, I should mention that the original draft created by Jeremy, who is of Vietnamese descent, did not have such diversity of characters. And one of the participants suggested to add a person in a wheelchair. So there's a lot that we can learn, and the discussion can be rich. In the co-creation of humor, we can sense what matters. The next one, also by Yasin, who is with us. And whether this is a government job or a job at a university or an opportunity to address risk in a humanitarian organization, these processes of exclusion happen in so many scales. And it's often because of how power is distributed, who holds it, and how does it change hands. Here's another cartoon for you. so much talking about delegating, participatory inclusion, and yet some of us hold on a little longer. And I am definitely part of this, and I'm trying to change. Last cartoon by Rohan from India. The token indigenous female speaker in the panel, which otherwise would have been a manel. And of course, it's great that there is now a sense of unacceptability of only white men in a panel. We need to do more, we can do more. Friends, this is the team that was part of making it all happen. On the right, colleagues from cartooncollections.com. On the left, colleagues from the World Bank family. On the top, Charlotte, Margaret, Brendan, Simone, Dr. Joy DeGruy, who was so instrumental, Marjorie. And let me see if I can become visible again. Maybe I should put my face, covering my own face. There we go. And now I will say thank you and pass it over to Janot, who will guide us through the rest of this session. One moment, please.
Hello. One of the things that I'd like to talk with you about is an activity we developed also using cartoons on colorism. What is colorism? Well, it's prejudice, it's discrimination, it's bias that is based on skin color. Dr. Joy DeGruy explains that colorism is light privilege. It's a socially constructed bias, and it's actually developed in cultures around the world. It can even be manifested within ethnic groups as a preference for people with lighter skin. So what we did is we used some cartoons. You can see the cartoon here. I like you, Harry. Even when your head's on fire, you don't complain. Well, we got permission from some of the cartoon artists. This one comes from PCV, and our colleagues at Cartoon Collections allowed us to colorize some of the cartoons. Now, you see the same cartoon, but with a different ethnicity. And what's interesting is that when people viewed both of these cartoons, they were able to actually observe how their own perception about that humorous, ironical, incongruous cartoon, how their own reaction to it changed. You can see one of the reactions with the colorized version, how far people of color have to go just to keep up is disgusting. Well, the word disgusting is a pretty powerful word. We have developed another activity with this wonderful team around the use of spoken word. And I'm going to introduce to you in a moment our dear colleague, Regie Gibson. This is not actually his first performance at Understanding Risk. You see him here on NASA's Hyperwall at Understanding Risk in Mexico, where he actually performed a soliloquy entitled "To geoengineer or not to geoengineer?" That is the question. Hacking the global climate with technology, blocking sunlight. But what the session was about was examining the social consequences, the unequal impacts of geoengineering potentially on different populations. And in a way, the performance that Regie is going to give you tonight, it connects to the same core theme of equity and inclusion. The session tonight is in part inspired by a session, one of the community sessions at Understanding Risk 2020 that some of you may have participated in, where we used spoken word in another tailored interactive platform. We call it the hip hop generator. People were able to go in and draw on their own creativity inspired by word association. And they created lines that Regie used to craft the performance that he's going to deliver this evening. Now, how we use a word in connection with other words, as Regie explained in our session on making meaning matters, it's in context that forms ideas, and ideas that point to a lived experience, a witnessed experience, or a known experience having to do with the way that racism and exclusion are drivers of risk is what has meaning to us. And we create that meaning together. As Pablo highlighted with Bob Mankoff's cartoon with the waterfall, we've got to talk. And the meaning that we make together matters. Because, as Regie says, how one makes meaning with words often affects attitudes and beliefs. These become actions, actions inform policies, and policy affects lives. So after this following performance, we're going to actually invite you to open up the chat and share what you're feeling, how the performance may invoke emotions, if you want to just name those emotions in the chat. And then we also invite you to reflect and maybe share some insights that you can draw from this performative experience. You may even want to share some actions that you feel committed to take as a takeaway from this understanding risk. So let me introduce Regie to you. He holds an MFA in poetry. He's received numerous awards. He's widely published. He is actually the recipient of the coveted Golden Pen Award. His competitions include the Absolute Poetry Award that he earned in Monfalcone, Italy, the Europe in Versi Award, and his volume of poetry, Storms Beneath the Skin from EM Press, is something you might be able to find on Amazon. I'm very pleased to present to you Regie Gibson, who, as the noted author Kurt Vonnegut said, "Regie, you sing and chant for all of us. Nobody gets left out."
Thank you, Janot. Good evening to everyone. It is indeed evening where I am, perhaps it's evening where you are. And I'd like to read to you this piece that I put together from some of the lines that was given to us earlier in the session, as Janot told you about. It's called Racism, Exclusion, and Risk. We've got work to do. Racism and exclusion puts too many lives at risk when it's already hard enough for so many to just exist. Many subsist in brutal ecologies, which is tough enough without having to float adrift in seas of hostile policies. Policies made by mindsets that refuse to heed forecasted disasters. Disasters that could have been prevented, or at least addressed sooner rather than after the fact. But that doesn't seem to happen as much as it should, as it could. Why is that? Could it be that often those most negatively affected, the populations most neglected, don't look like, live like, vote like, worship like those making the policy decisions? Or like those holding the purse strings, or simply aren't old or influential enough to demand a say in things. Possibly. I mean, we know that political and natural shocks come and go, but somehow policies based on racism and exclusion seem to stay. Is there something perhaps within us that seems to like it that way? Can't we reimagine a better future with better days? Can't we conjure and create new and better ways? Why do so many of us listen to the voices of never? The voices that say, I will not give up one creature comfort for anyone, including and especially them, ever. Not even for the chance at a better humanity. Voices of those grown comfortable with angry racial calamity, who believe that equity and equality are ignorant frivolities and have no interest in racial amity. Perhaps some of these are members of your own families. Well, they're also members of mine. And perhaps because we love them, at times we've ignored their ugly mentalities, began even accepting their dismissive, shrug-shouldered toleration of brutality. If you are like me, you probably wonder, where is our braveness in these times filled with so much graveness? Where is our refusal to buckle? Where is our desire to bring the muscle, sinew, and nerve to serve in these times filled with so much struggle, so much doubt and drought and flood and dim tides of human blood? What happened to our desire to speak up and take action? What happened to our fiery, fierce compassion? Did it get into a car crash? Develop a bad case of whiplash? Did we put its neck in a brace so it cannot turn around and face how inhumane we have so often been to one another? Oh, dear sisters and brothers, in-betweens and others, these are ways of being that we as members of this species have to own. Our complicity must be made known, at the very least, to ourselves at least. We must be brave enough to ask, what is this rough, slouching beast that has caused so much unnecessary human suffering and pain? We must be brave enough to face the fact that it sometimes wears our faces and often will answer to our names. What do we have to lose if we confront that monster within us? When compared to all we have to gain, what do we lose? Rising despair, imminent warfare, environmental nightmares, a world that's unfair in which we all can share. What do we gain? A possibility to repair what's broken. We gain the notion of a world that has been cracked open and can now be stitched back together and made much better by threading it with truth, reconciliation, and a humanistic sense of hope. And isn't that worth it? Clearly, many of us here think so. And we are not alone, despite how sometimes it feels like it. Look around, and you'll see others here like you who wish to fight this virus of human disunity. Invest time in vaccinating themselves against it through a kind of resilient herd immunity. One developed by being together in a community built brilliantly on responsive learning, anti-racism, non-exclusion, and equal opportunity. See, we have work to do. We have no time for seductive human embitterment. We need to be dedicated to the production of human betterment. Make sure resources for disasters are not tossed around, misused, or abused, but are better spent. See, we have work to do. Work to rise above our comfortable fears. Clear our ears of the naysayers' jeers so we can hear the flood before it comes. Help those taken underwater to learn to swim and catch those who just want to take the money and run. We have work to do. Work to stay alert for the coming disasters that the excluded will surely face. Work to make the early warning systems turn a blind eye to race. Work to securely cement vacillating climate support and make sure that the youngest among us have both voice and choice. Work that creates bridges across the vast chasms of human understanding. Work that manages to bring sanity to humanity, that renews the blue of our planet, that rectifies this world's wrongs. Work that lets all the victims put at risk by racism and exclusion know that, like us, they are not alone, though sometimes it feels like it. Let them know they are more than voiceless statistics, hopelessly lost in the thick mist of politics and big business. Yes, we've got work to do. So let us continue to do it. Each day, putting our shoulder steady to the rock, ready to get sweaty and get to it. Every day, understanding just a little bit more that a better world is not only possible, but that it will happen. It will happen if we believe and if we show up every day, willing and ready to roll up our sleeves and get cracking. Roll up your sleeves. Don't get despaired, get to work. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak with you.